Now, in this video, we're going to talk about why does the aggregate demand curve slope downward. Recall that aggregate demand in a macroeconomic sense, we're talking about aggregate demand, so that is the quantity, or it refers to the quantity of goods and services demanded in the economy at any given price level. Now, you can think about the demand for goods and services as being reflected in the real GDPY, which is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And the price level is just any type of price index like the CPI or GDP deflator. Now, any movement along the demand curve, so let's say this is a price level of 100 and this is a price level of 80, you're going to see that demand at 100 is going to be lower. So let's call this Y1 and let's call this Y2. Y1 is going to be less than Y2. So as the price decreases or overall price level decreases, the demand for goods and services is going to rise as reflected in Y, which is our real GDP. So since we understand this equation very well, Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, we can understand this equation to think about why aggregate demand slopes downwards. And for that, we need to understand the relationship that price has, the relationship of price with each of these variables. Now, we leave government spending out because government spending is a fixed policy variable. So we don't talk about that at all. But when we think about any of these scenarios where where we're thinking about the relationship between price and consumption, price and investment, and price and net exports, we will be assuming that money supply in the economy is fixed. Okay, so money supply is not changing in the economy when we think about the aggregate demand sloping downwards. So there are three different explanations to why the aggregate demand slopes downwards. The first one is called the wealth effect, and that is telling us the relationship between prices and consumption. So let's think about a scenario where the price level falls. So in general, if the price level falls, which is again like an overall price index in the economy, like the CPI or GDP deflator, the money in consumers' pockets increases in value, right? So you would feel as a consumer that if overall level of prices is falling, that your purchasing power has gone up. So consumers would feel wealthier and they would spend more. And so when you think about that equation, Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, we know that if price falls, consumption goes up, and that would have a positive effect on Y, right? So price and output, which is Y, move in the opposite direction. And that's one reason why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So price decreases, consumption is higher, Y has gone up. So this right here and this right here is showing you an inverse relationship. And that's the reason why the aggregate demand curve is, or one of the reasons why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. The second reason for why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward is due to the interest rate effect. And this is really examining the relationship between price and investment. Now, think about prices falling, and think about this scenario one more time. So if prices fall, at a lower price level, households would have to hold less money to buy goods and services. And so they may have more savings. In other words, more private savings, because private savings are the savings of the households. So those savings could be used in buying bonds or stocks or equities, or depositing cash in banks and things like that. So if you recall your loanable funds model, these are loanable funds, and this is the interest rate, the real interest rate. This is the demand for loanable funds, and this is the supply of loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds is coming from national savings, which is the sum of private and public savings. So if households are going to save more, the supply is going to shift to the right, okay? And that's going to lower the interest rate. So at this point, interest rate falls, okay? And as the interest rate falls, this gives a boost to investment. Investment rises because now it's more inexpensive to borrow. And so again, we see that if we go back to this national income identity, we see that as price falls or interest rate falls and investment goes up, right? So investment goes up and therefore GDP would go up, real GDP would go up. And again, you see this inverse relationship between price and output. And this is called the interest rate effect. And this is another reason for why aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Now, the last reason for why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward is the relationship between prices and net exports. Okay, and we've already seen that when there is a price fall or a price decrease, the real interest rate also falls. So they move in the same direction. When the real interest rate falls in the United States, then US investors would desire foreign bonds or assets. So money would flow outside of the United States, and the demand for the US dollar is going to fall. And as the demand for the US dollar falls, the real exchange rate depreciates. If the real exchange rate depreciates, our goods become cheaper for the world market to consume, and that boosts our net exports. So net exports go up, and again, you can see in the national income identity, if net exports go up, Y also goes up, right? Y also goes up. And so there is again this inverse relationship between P and Y, which gives rise to this downward slope of the aggregate demand curve.